The river ran quiet that autumn, its surface thick with fog and fallen leaves. Locals said the land beyond its bend was cursed, that nothing truly living stayed there for long. Yet on that lonely stretch of soil stood a farmhouse, pale and peeling, where Abraham Holt lived with his 7 daughters. The Holts were a family that belonged to no one. They traded rarely, spoke softly, and kept to themselves. People in town said they heard laughter at night, children's voices drifting across the water, even though no one had seen another soul on that land in years. When the government sent a surveyor to mark the riverbank, he didn't return. Days later, his truck was found abandoned near the old Holt fence, its engine cold, the driver's door wide open, as if he'd stepped out and never come back. Deputies crossed the property line the next morning. They described the air as heavy, like it hadn't been breathed in decades. The front door hung crooked, swinging with each gust, and inside, the walls were covered in carvings, circles, symbols, lines that twisted like vines. In the parlor, they found photographs pinned to the wallpaper, their edges burned, the faces scratched out, except for one, Abraham's staring straight at the camera with a faint, unsettling smile. Upstairs, every bed was made, every window nailed shut. In one room, 7 dresses hung in a perfect row, each one smaller than the last. On the kitchen table lay a Bible, its pages swollen from moisture, open to a verse about blood and unity. The floorboards groaned under the deputy's boots, and somewhere in the house, something dripped steadily, though no leak could be found. The stench was unbearable, a mix of mildew and something sweetly rotten, clinging to their clothes even after they left. They searched the grounds for days but found no sign of Abraham or the girls. Only a note remained, written in dark ink and pinned beneath a candle stub. It read, "We are one flesh." The handwriting was uneven, as if several hands had written it together. When the sheriff read it aloud, the candle's flame flickered, though there was no wind. By nightfall, the farmhouse was boarded up and left to the weeds. But those who lived nearby swore the laughter still carried across the river after sunset, faint, overlapping, and too many voices for one family alone. The Holt family existed on paper, but only barely. When officials went through the old census books, they found something that made them stop. 7 daughters, Miriam, Clara, Ruth, Esther, June, Violet, and Rose, all born within the same year. No mother listed. No birth records filed at the county. Just Abraham's name, written 7 times, as both father and head of household. The clerk who had filled out those pages in 1946 left a note in the margin that read, "Mother deceased," though no death certificate was ever found. It was as if the girls had appeared out of the earth itself. Neighbors said the girls rarely came into town. Once, a grocer's wife remembered seeing them through the trees, walking in single file, each wearing the same plain dress, each carrying a tin pail. Their faces were pale, drained of sunlight, and their hair hung in braids that looked identical, as though they'd been measured. No one could ever tell them apart, except for Miriam, the eldest, who always stood slightly ahead, as if she knew where the others should step. People said Abraham forbade schooling. When asked why, he said, "What God teaches at home is enough." As years passed, the Holt daughters became a kind of ghost story, whispered at the diner. Farmers claimed they saw lights moving through the fields after midnight, lanterns swinging in rhythm, like a procession. Others swore they heard voices drifting over the crops, singing hymns that didn't belong to any church. The voices blended so perfectly that no one could tell how many there were. Some described it as beautiful. Others said it sounded wrong too, even too inhuman, like one voice copied over itself 7 times. Then there was the photograph, the only one that ever surfaced. Found decades later in a local archive, it showed the 7 girls standing in a line beside their father. The photo was faintly overexposed, but the details were clear enough to unsettle anyone who looked too long. Each girl's face was nearly identical, their expressions hollow, their eyes unfocused, as if they were looking somewhere just beyond the lens. Abraham stood behind them, his hand resting on Miriam's shoulder, the faintest smile curving his mouth. The archivist who discovered the photo noted that his hand seemed to blur slightly, as though it had been moving when the picture was taken, or as though it wasn't entirely there. When investigators reviewed the image, they realized what the locals had never dared to ask. How could 7 girls born within months look so alike, so perfectly symmetrical? It was as if their faces were mirrored versions of one another, reflections, not individuals. The deeper they searched, the less sense it made. The Holt daughters weren't just kept hidden, they were preserved, molded, perhaps even recreated, in some way only Abraham understood. Those who studied the case said the photograph seemed to hum when scanned, as if carrying some static charge. The sound was faint, almost like singing, and in that low, trembling tone, one question remained: if the daughters never left the house, then whose laughter still echoed beyond the river? The farmhouse had been empty for almost 20 years when the renovation began. In the summer of 1963, new owners bought the land, planning to tear down what remained of the Holt house and build something new. But as workers pulled up the warped floorboards in what had once been the parlor, their crowbars struck hollow wood. Beneath the boards lay a small trapdoor sealed shut with rusted nails. When they pried it open, the smell that escaped was thick and old, a mix of damp soil, rot, and something sweet, like dried flowers. Inside, they found a narrow staircase leading down into the dark. The hidden cellar was small, barely wide enough for 2 men to stand side by side. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves sat dozens of rusted tins, their lids warped and their labels peeled away. Inside each tin was a bundle of letters, all carefully wrapped in cloth and tied with faded twine. Most were unreadable, the ink long washed out by moisture, but one small leather-bound book survived. It was a diary, its first page signed in a delicate hand, Miriam Holt, Year of Our Lord 1945. At first her words painted an ordinary life. She wrote about tending the fields, gathering eggs, mending dresses. She described her sisters as obedient and gentle, always singing while they worked. There were notes about their father, how he prayed with them at dawn and read aloud from a family Bible that no visitor had ever seen. But slowly, the writing changed. The words became erratic, the ink darker, pressed deep into the paper, as if carved by fear. She wrote of father's sacred ceremony, of a night when the candles burned low and the air filled with smoke that smelled of iron. She wrote of seed meant to purify the line, of daughters chosen to bear perfection. One passage described the sound of crying beneath the house. The little ones, she wrote, they are born, but not for long. Father says they are the broken ones. We must keep the blood clean before dawn. Another entry ended abruptly after the line. He says we are the garden, and he is the root. The final pages were smeared, as though written in a trembling hand, ending with the words, "He has found a way to live through us." When authorities were called, they labeled the diary as hysteria, the product of a girl isolated too long from the world. But decades later, when descendants were traced for property records, scientists examined the Holt bloodline. The results defied explanation. Every Holt child, across generations, carried identical paternal markers, so exact they were almost cloned. And though Abraham Holt had died in 1946, his genetic signature was still alive in those who came after. The diary's warnings had not been delusion. They had been prophecy. Fairbend was a town that liked to forget. After the war, its streets filled with new shops, new homes, and families eager to move forward. But just 5 miles out, the Holt property still stood, a rotting skeleton of wood and memory. People drove past it without turning their heads. When newcomers asked about the farmhouse by the river, the answer was always the same: best to leave that alone. The sheriff's files were emptied, court documents went missing, birth records were burned. The town clerk at the time called it an act of mercy, said they owed the Holts peace. But peace wasn't what they were keeping. It was silence. In church, old priests spoke softly about the family. They said prayers were once held on that land, blessings whispered to keep the soil calm. One priest, long retired, admitted before his death that he'd been asked to perform a cleansing there. He refused to call it an exorcism. "We weren't casting something out," he said. "We were sealing it in." Locals remembered seeing him that night, candles lit at the property's edge, mirrors covered in white cloth, a circle drawn into the dirt. By morning, the candles had burned down to wax puddles, and the old man walked home without a word. He left town soon after. When journalist Margaret Lane reopened the Holt case in 1982, she expected resistance. What she didn't expect was fear. People closed their doors when she mentioned the name. Some who'd grown up near the Holts refused to speak on record. Others claimed they still heard voices from the chapel ruins at night, murmurs that sounded like prayer, or maybe pleading. One woman, a neighbor's daughter, said she remembered Abraham standing outside his barn years ago, preaching to no one. His voice carried over the fields, saying, "The body must return to itself." Margaret found the chapel ruins a week later, hidden behind vines and collapsed timber. Inside, she counted 7 candle stubs, arranged in a perfect circle. The mirrors that had once hung on the walls were shattered, their pieces scattered across the dirt like frozen water. When she lifted one shard to the light, her reflection split, her face doubled, then tripled, until she couldn't tell which one was hers. Fairbend never forgave her for digging. After her article was published, no one would speak to her again. Some said she made it all up. Others whispered that she'd disturbed what the town had spent 40 years trying to bury. But in Fairbend, silence wasn't born of ignorance. It was built from guilt. Because deep down they hadn't been blind to what Abraham Holt was doing. They had seen everything, and they had chosen to look away. By 1999, the Holt property was more memory than land, overgrown with weeds, the farmhouse collapsed into itself, and the orchard thick with twisted trees that bore no fruit. Locals said the ground had turned sour, that nothing good would grow where that kind of sin had taken root. But when an anonymous letter arrived at the county office, claiming the orchard hides what the house could not, the past stirred again. Forensic teams were sent in quietly, hoping to settle decades of rumor. What they found did not settle anything. It only made the whispers louder. The dig began at dawn. The air heavy and wet. Shovels struck hard soil, the kind that doesn't want to be opened. Hours passed before one worker uncovered the first bundle, a small shape wrapped tightly in burlap. At first they thought it was an animal. Then the cloth tore. Tiny bones, curled and delicate, fell into the dirt. One by one, they kept coming. 7 in total, each buried beneath a different tree, each wrapped the same way, each marked by the same faint symbol, 2 intersecting circles drawn in ash across the cloth. When the remains were examined, the findings silenced the room. None of the infants were more than a few weeks old. All bore severe deformities, fused ribs, twisted limbs, skulls that seemed slightly too large or too small. But the horror ran deeper than what could be seen. DNA testing confirmed that every child was related, all carrying Abraham Holt's blood, not once, but twice. He was both their father and, in a way no one could explain, their mirror. The genetic code repeated itself unnaturally, looping like a reflection caught between 2 facing mirrors. One forensic analyst, a man with 30 years in the field, could barely speak when he looked at the results. "It's as if," he said quietly, "the same body was trying to remake itself again and again, and failing." The samples showed anomalies no database could match. Strands of DNA appeared incomplete, self-consuming, as though the code was fighting to perfect something that wasn't meant to exist. They reburied the infants together in a single grave at the edge of the orchard, marking the spot with a simple cross. But the earth there never settled. Each season, the grass above it grew faster, thicker, darker than anywhere else. The scientists left with their data, the town went back to pretending, and the orchard stood silent, except when the wind moved through it. Then sometimes people said they could hear faint humming, the kind that sounds almost like lullabies. And if you stood long enough, the branches would seem to bend toward the soil, as though the trees themselves were trying to listen to what still slept beneath them. By the early 2000s, the Holt name had vanished from public record, but the blood had not. Across small towns and quiet cities, people began to appear who shared traits no genealogy could explain: pale grey eyes that caught light strangely, a crookedness in the left hand, as though the bones had remembered an old break, and a faint crescent birthmark behind the right ear. Most never knew they were connected, but some did. They said they had dreams that felt shared, as if lived together. A man standing in a field of mirrors, his reflection split 7 ways, whispering, "The family must be whole again." Researchers traced the descendants through old medical files and unclaimed birth certificates. The pattern was undeniable. None of them were direct relatives on paper, yet their DNA lined up like repeating echoes. Journalists called it a coincidence, a biological fluke. But those who knew the Holt story whispered that Abraham had found a way to survive through his blood, that he'd built a pattern strong enough to outlive flesh. The theory sounded impossible, but so did everything else about the Holts. When a small documentary crew arrived at the ruins of the farmhouse to film a feature on America's forgotten cults, they expected folklore, not evidence. The place was almost gone by then. Just a few leaning beams, a chimney of soot-stained stone, and the remnants of the cellar where Miriam's diary had once been found. The crew set up cameras, recorders, and thermal sensors. For most of the night, nothing happened. The air was still, the orchard quiet. Then, just before dawn, a faint humming began, through the static of their audio feed. It wasn't interference, it was singing, 7 voices, soft and distant, weaving through each other in harmony. The lullaby was wordless, but eerily familiar, matching a melody once transcribed from Miriam's diary. As the recording continued, the voices grew clearer, closer, until one female voice whispered, "He's still here." The footage cut abruptly. When reviewed later, the sound technician noticed that in one frame, just before the camera shut off, there was a figure standing at the edge of the cellar steps. Its face was obscured by glare, but the outline of its left hand was unmistakably crooked. When the documentary aired months later, the production team refused interviews. 2 of them reportedly left the industry altogether. One of the descendants who'd seen the film claimed he recognized the figure, not as Abraham, but as himself. His DNA test later revealed a match so close to the original Holt samples that geneticists called it a recurrence, not inheritance. The investigation ended with no explanation that satisfied science or faith, but those who have studied the case say the same thing. Abraham Holt never wanted a family, he wanted a way to remain, and through the faces that keep returning, he has. In the present day, the Holt case no longer sits in the archives of small-town police or old library vaults. It rests in sterile laboratories, beneath white light and humming machines that do not believe in superstition. When genetic researchers reopened the Holt samples, it was meant to be routine, a final check before disposal. What they found instead has no place in science. Under the microscope, the preserved blood cells were still active. Their sequences shifted, rearranging themselves, as if searching for something missing. The data flickered, unstable, but constant, like a heartbeat struggling to remember its rhythm. Dr. Evelyn March, the lead geneticist on the project, first thought it was a malfunction. Samples that old shouldn't have moved, shouldn't have lived. But every test she ran returned the same anomaly. The DNA strands folded and unfolded in precise patterns, almost rhythmic, almost deliberate. Under ultraviolet light, they pulsed, faintly but undeniably, as if responding to observation. She described it in her report as behavioral, then crossed the word out. On the 5th day, the sequences began to form mirrored chains, perfect reflections looping endlessly back into themselves. Dr. March watched as the code seemed to stabilize into something she could no longer categorize. It wasn't mutation, it was memory. Her colleagues grew uneasy. One claimed to hear faint static from the observation speakers, though the monitors were silent. Another refused to stay past dusk, saying the lights in the lab dimmed on their own when she handled the slides. Evelyn worked alone that final night, her recorder running. The last entry captured her whispering, "It's communicating." After that, nothing but silence. 3 days later, she vanished. Her apartment was locked from the inside. Her car, untouched. The only thing left on her lab desk was a single sheet of paper scrawled with trembling ink. "The lineage is awake." The investigation into her disappearance led nowhere. The Holt samples were missing, logged out by no one. The security footage from that night froze at 2:47 a.m., showing a shadow moving across the floor, one that didn't match any living person in the room. The lab sealed its records. Unofficially, those who had seen the data believed the blood had evolved. It no longer needed a body. It had learned to survive without one. The final scene of the documentary returns to the Holt ruins. The camera moves slowly through the orchard, where new trees have sprouted between the old. Rain falls softly, soaking into the black soil. For a moment, nothing moves, and then the earth begins to breathe. Pockets of air rise through the puddles, followed by the soft crack of shifting bone. Tiny fragments surface like shells on a tide, pale and unbroken despite decades underground. The cameraman whispers that he smells iron, thick and sweet. The shot lingers as the narrator speaks one last time, his voice low, reverent, almost mournful. Science will say it was coincidence. Faith will call it curse. But the truth lies somewhere in between. Abraham Holt did not die in 1946. The wind moves through the orchard, bending the trees as if they are listening. He multiplied. The screen fades to black, but the audio continues for 3 more seconds. A faint lullaby drifts through the static. 7 voices, soft and steady, humming a tune no one alive remembers teaching. And in that final breath of sound, just before silence returns, there is a whisper. It isn't a prayer, it's a promise. We are still here,